Hello and welcome to Newscentre. I'm Parikshit. US President Joe Biden and China's Xi Jinping held a summit in San Francisco in an attempt to repair the strained relationship between both nations. This was the first face-to-face meeting in a year and Xi Jinping's first visit to the United States in 6 years. Both leaders said this meeting was among the most constructive and productive talks they have had. The bilateral talks lasted for more than 4 hours at a mansion outside of San Francisco. Both leaders agreed on 3 issues: limiting drug trafficking, restoring military communication, and establishing a dialogue on the global risks posed by artificial intelligence. However, several flashpoints remain, including Taiwan. Jinping reportedly told Biden that Taiwan is potentially the most dangerous issue in their relationship. Just hours after the meeting, Biden called Jinping a dictator who runs a communist party. On the other hand, President Xi told a group of American executives US and China can either be adversaries or partners, and there can be no middle ground.
I'm pleased to announce that after many years of being on hold, we are restarting cooperation between the United States and PRC on counter-narcotics. We're reassuming military-to-military contacts, direct contacts. As a lot of you press know who follow this, that's been cut off, and it's been very worrisome. That's how accidents happen. We're going to get our experts together to discuss risk and safety issues associated with artificial intelligence.
China is willing to be a partner and friend with the United States. China never bets on the US to lose, never interferes in US internal affairs, and has no intention to challenge or replace the United States. Similarly, the United States should not bet on China's loss, refrain from interfering in China's internal affairs, and should welcome a peaceful, stable, and prosperous China.
To take this discussion forward, I'm now joined by Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the United States, foreign affairs analyst and author Zorawar Daulet Singh, and former Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal. Thank you very much for joining us. Ambassador Sibal, if I can begin with you. Do you think this meeting in San Francisco, which lasted a little over 4 hours, has established guardrails or a base beyond which the two sides will not allow the relationship to deteriorate?
Well, you know, the United States has been saying for a long time that they want guardrails to be established so that the differences that they have should not lead to an actual military conflict. They were very keen to start military-to-military dialogue. In fact, they were saying this in a way that, to my mind, diminished the United States as a military power, because they were pleading with China to restart the military-to-military talks, whereas China was holding back, earlier saying that unless you remove the sanctions on their former defense minister, there can't be talks, and then generally dragging their feet. And now, of course, they have agreed to resume talks, including a hotline between theater commanders, as also some of the mechanisms that they had, for example, a high-level military-to-military cooperative dialogue, a defense policy coordination talks, China maritime cooperation agreement, etc., etc. But the point is that this does not rule out continuing differences and, in fact, a degree of confrontation between the United States and China in the Western Pacific, because Biden made it very clear that he's going to go ahead and deepen their relationship with their allies and partners, and spoke again of the Indo-Pacific in a very robust way, cautioned China against any adventurism in Taiwan, said very clearly that they will come to the aid of their allies in a case of a crisis, and asked China to observe restraint because they have been taking some military actions against Taiwan, threatening military actions. He asked them to show restraint in that regard. Then, of course, he raised the issue of human rights. You know, he mentioned Xinjiang, he mentioned Tibet, he mentioned Hong Kong. So as I was reading the readout from the American side, it was very clear to me that on all the core points, they have not yielded substantially, at least in public. But yes, whatever they wanted in terms of military talks, fentanyl and all that, they agreed on that, but that doesn't actually in any way remove all these serious differences. Incidentally, he also said that United States, in fact, he said the United States will continue its technology denial to China. He said that also. In fact, if you read it, it doesn't open up much possibility of any across-the-board movement of relationship in a very serious way between China and the United States. China, on the other hand, Xi Jinping.
And I think what's really stood out.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
And I think what's really stood out, Ambassador Sibal, in the international media is the fact that in the end, when he was asked that, would you still call him a dictator? And he said, in a way, yes, he is the leader of a communist country. So in that sense, he is a dictator. And he also reminded the press about the AUKUS agreement, the agreement for submarines to Australia, the assistance to Philippines, and US actions in Indo-Pacific and South China Sea. Ambassador Meera, Shankar, if I were to get you in, how do you see the body language of the two leaders? There were some very interesting pictures that came out when Biden was seeing off President Xi Jinping. He admired the Chinese president's vehicle. He said, this is a beautiful vehicle, very similar to the Cadillac we've got there. You know what it's called? It's called the Beast. He even went ahead and looked inside the vehicle. Before that, on his own phone, he showed Xi Jinping a photograph of Xi Jinping as a young man in the 80s at the Golden Bridge. How do you see the optics?
Look, I think this meeting has been less stiff than some of the meetings, I think the last year which they had on the sidelines of Bali. I think the body language this time has been a little easier. But, you know, I would really look at the outcomes and what the objectives were. I think the objective for the US going in was really stabilization of the relationship and conflict prevention. If you look at their overall national security strategy, it speaks of a fairly complex policy on China, which says that they will compete vigorously with China and outcompete them where it matters, but that they do not seek conflict. And they will also cooperate with China where they can. And here they mention issues such as climate change, dealing with global pandemics, nuclear proliferation, the global economy. So they mention these global issues as areas where they would like to reestablish some kind of cooperation with China. Now, from this meeting, what we are seeing is that the two countries have really agreed to resume military-to-military talks, which had broken down after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. There have been no military contacts, and near misses where Chinese ships have come too close to US ships on patrol or freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. And also, you know, the surrounding of Taiwan through jet fighter planes and ships, naval ships, which have violated Taiwan's zones, air defense and other zones. So it's been a fairly difficult situation. At Bali, the US had sought to stabilize the relationship, but then you had the Chinese balloon episode over the US, which delayed the process. And of course, for the US, I would say engaged as it is now on two fronts, with Ukraine and then in the Mediterranean because of the Israel-Gaza-Hamas conflict, that they would want to ensure that China doesn't play negatively or too negatively in either of these two theaters. And I think the Chinese, looking at their economic interests and the fact that the Chinese economy has been very tepid and has been facing serious structural issues, would also like to see some mending of fences, if not an improvement of relations.
That's an important
because
point.
I think the basic strategic competition, technological competition, economic competition, military competition between these two great powers is going to continue. But there is an effort to ensure conflict prevention and a more complex strategy than pure containment.
Right. Zorawar, Daulet Singh, do you feel that it was President Xi Jinping who walked away with a victory after this conversation? Would you give him that? Also, do you feel that there was a warning to the United States as well when he said there are two options to this relationship, frankly? One is to enhance solidarity and cooperation, join hands to meet global challenges. The other is to cling to a zero-sum mentality, provoke rivalry and confrontation, and drive the world towards turmoil and division. The choice could decide the future of humanity and planet Earth. What do you think was the big message in this to the United States?
See, Parikshit, I think leading up to this summit, there have been concerted attempts by both Washington and Beijing to stabilize ties. So this hasn't come out of the blue. They've been attempting this for the past year. The United States, in fact, as we see, has been focusing on other theaters, particularly its confrontation with Russia and its investments in the Middle East. So I think the United States, in a sense, is recognizing realism. It does not have the power advantage over China that it perhaps would have liked to have to bargain from a position of strength. So I think there's an understanding that that it has to deal with China. The Chinese, for their part, have always wanted some kind of a stable equation with the United States while they compete and keep rising as a major power. So it is certainly I would say it's a win-win to some extent, but the Chinese have really come out in a sense and have blunted the sort of the hawks in the United States who perhaps would have preferred a shift from the confrontation with Russia towards a far more aggressive security posture in the Western Pacific and Asia. So I think in that sense, we are seeing a US-China relationship that is likely to be far more complex, as has been alluded to, but there's competition and there's competition, right? So the range of strategic competition can vary from outright Cold War hostility to something which involves interdependence, contact, responsible military competition, as they're calling it. They've enhanced, frankly, communications with their theater commanders, right up to a hotline from the White House to Beijing. So you're seeing really concrete decisions have been taken by both sides to put those guardrails, as you had mentioned. There is a flaw now on the Sino-American relationship. And I think there's also a recognition, if you look at very carefully about domestic politics in the United States and the West, I think there's no stomach for this kind of a dual containment strategy where they could sort of, envelop and surround this Eurasian landmass like they had done in the first Cold War. So frankly, for the rest of us looking in Asia, I think they cannot but be a cause for at least circumspection and caution in terms of where this is heading. Because if you look at the joint statement and the readouts from the White House, they speak about ironclad commitments only to US allies in East Asia. So while there is an acknowledgement that the partners like India matter, but frankly, when it comes to the unfolding of the next phase of this summit, which is how this Thor will get operationalized, I think India needs to keep an eye on frankly, where it's heading and come to certain conclusions that it's perhaps going to be a little bit on its own in terms of how it's managing its core security challenges with China. Now, where that leads to, I think, is a second order question. But certainly the United States and China, after the summit, have decided to put or defer the culmination of a Cold War.
Right. This is indeed important, and India, of course, will be watching closely. And we share a border with China, so tensions with China in that sense are very, very real. We'll take a short break at this point, but don't go anywhere. This discussion is just getting more interesting. We'll be back with Ambassador Meera, Shankar, Ambassador Sibal, and Zorawar Daulet Singh. Don't go anywhere. We're heading into a short. All right, let's begin with our discussion now. We are joined by Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, Ambassador Meera Shankar, and also Zorawar Daulet Singh. Ambassador Sibal, if I can begin with you, when it comes to India, how do you think India should be reading these developments which have taken place in San Francisco, and how should we manage the relationship with China going forward?
Look, first of all, this is not a surprise for us. The United States has been saying for a long time that they want to put guardrails in their ties with China in order to avoid a military conflict. They met at Bali, the two leaders. And now they have met at San Francisco. So it's not as if this is coming out of the blue. And don't forget that just before this, we had the 2+2 in Delhi. And the US Secretary of State and US Secretary of Defense traveled to India despite their preoccupation with a very dangerous situation developing in the Middle East. Why was this done? I think this was done also partly to send a message to China before the Xi Jinping Biden meeting that in terms of the relationship with India and in terms of their Indo-Pacific strategy and Quad, the policy, that policy will remain intact. In fact, will be reinforced. And if you see what happened during the 2+2 talks in terms of beefing up our military capabilities and everything else, it is very clear that the United States is not walking away from its Indo-Pacific strategy simply because they want to stabilize relations with China. That's one. The other is okay to talk about stability, but does stability mean that US is going to reverse its policies? They won't. Will China reverse its policies in the South China Sea or East China Sea or vis-a-vis Taiwan or vis-a-vis India? No. In fact, Xi Jinping said very clearly that Taiwan is part of China and will inevitably become a part of China. He didn't budge on that. Yes, of course, since it was a summit meeting there or summit conversation there, he didn't want to spoil the mood of the occasion, and he has to watch what happens back home. And therefore, he had a little, his concern, his tone was not aggressive, whereas the US tone seems to have been much more aggressive, if you like. But at the same time, Xi Jinping laid out his ambition very clearly when he said, and you quoted him, that there's no option but to it can either be partnership or rivalry, and there's no other option, and together we can do this and that, for planet Earth and for the world, this is what is needed. Basically, what he's trying to convey is that he sees the world eventually moving towards a G2, where there'll be some kind of understanding between these two. And then, of course, Mr. Xi Jinping says rather absurdly that in the 70 years of China's CC governance, they have not committed aggression against any country or taken over an inch of land from any other country. So you can see that in terms of their basic position, there is not much change. But to come back to what I said, I don't think that we should talk. We should think of stabilizing the relationship in the sense of a new opening in the ties between the two countries, leading to a kind of cooperation that existed before Trump began his various negative policies towards China.
Okay, let me.
Competition is strategic. The competition is.
Ambassador Sibal. Yeah, Ambassador Sibal, I'm going to return to that thought, but Ambassador Meera Shankar, when it comes to the 5 principles laid out by Xi Jinping, what do you think and how do you read them in terms of a starting point in a new era for US-China relations? Will this be a new era in US-China relations, as Xi Jinping put it, starting from San Francisco?
I don't think it'll be a new era. I think the fundamentals in the relationship are leading towards more strategic competition. But at the same time, there's a sense of realism in the US that they cannot take on a direct confrontation with China. So they will do what they can in terms of technology denial, in terms of de-risking supply chains. For instance, if you saw in the economic framework of, the Indo-Pacific, they've just signed an agreement just yesterday on resilient supply chains and de-risking and looking at alternative sources of supply and so on. So I'm sure that many of the policies which have been set in motion will continue, the Quad will continue, the strengthening of allies will continue. What will get impacted because of immediate crises which the US has got embroiled in other theaters is their ability to deploy their full resources and full attention on this theater. But they have also appointed a new Deputy Secretary of State who was the chief coordinator at the White House for the Indo-Pacific and China strategy of the Biden administration to ensure that as these crises, dominate, and as the US goes into a presidential election year, there is continuity and somebody keeping their eye on the ball as far as the Indo-Pacific strategy is concerned. But clearly, it will impinge on their ability to deploy the full scale of resources that they might otherwise have, turned towards the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, Zorawar, do you get a sense that the resumption of the military communications was the most significant part? And what's currently happening in the Middle East, what's happening with Israel and Hamas right now, in terms of bringing down tensions, bringing the conflict to an end, that military hotline will be very critical to the wars that we're seeing in Ukraine and in Middle East right now?
See, so both sides have benefited from this. The flashpoint of Taiwan Straits, which over the last year, we had begun to see a glimpse of a possibility of maybe an accidental escalation or an escalation where this brinksmanship might just get out of hand. So I think by putting those tactical, operational, and political level communication links and putting them into places, you eliminated the possibility of something just sort of getting out of hand. Also, I think what the United States is really admitting to tacitly is that it's not ready for creating a new front in Asia. Many people were speaking about NATO coming into the Pacific and a second front coming up or a third front coming up. I think in that sense, things have calmed down. I'd also sort of mention this idea of, while there is going to be strategic competition, I think what both sides have done is, and I think here the Chinese have been particularly smart, perhaps just the way they define their core interests, they've kept it pretty limited. They're telling the United States that we are not ready to displace you, we are not going to challenge your world leadership. What they really are saying is right now, two things will invite a counter-reaction or hostility or even military conflict. If the West and the United States tries to change China, disrupt its domestic political system, and transform it. So, democracy promotion, that's something which will, of course, invite a massive backlash. And the second is the question of Taiwan. There's only one single political question where you could see the United States and the Chinese militaries actually engaging in hot conflict. It's only over Taiwan. So on that, what the United States has very smartly done is it's kind of push the subject sort of further down by saying they reiterate the one China policy. They have a fairly complex 4-decade-old policy of ambiguity on Taiwan, where they will ensure Taiwan is not toppled over externally, but at the same time, they are assuring the Chinese that they will not support an independent policy taking root in Taiwan. So I think this situation gives the Chinese enough room domestically, Xi Jinping enough room domestically to now operationalize this thaw and come to some of the other areas where they both want to engage, which is the economy, frankly. So we might even see very high quality investments resume, trade, possibly even FDI back and forth, high level contacts. So I think they have contained those core areas which could really disrupt the relationship for now, at least.
All right, we've run out of time, but Ambassador Sibal, Ambassador Meera, Shankar, Zorawar, Daulet, Singh, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Clearly, the world would be watching this meeting, the optics very, very closely. But let's see if US and China are able to minimize tensions going forward and collaborate on framing guardrails around AI and other areas of competition. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Newscentre. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.